So I'm going to get started by just with a question, all right, and ask you to think about this question. But the question is just simply this: what have you done? Okay. Now think about when you hear that question. What have you done? In particular, maybe hearing that question when you're a little bit in trouble. What have you done? Right? So maybe it goes a little bit like this. You walk into the house, you open the door. Smells a little bit like garbage. You see the bones and scraps from last night's dinner around, and you see the dog over in the corner, and you're like, Jet, what have you done? Right? Jet, that's the name of my son's dog, and Jet would never do anything like that. He's such a great little black lab, but anyways, right? Maybe that's happened to you. What have you done, Jet? Or what have you done? I said this to my one of my grandchildren fairly recently. I was responsible to watch this child, and I won't name if it's a boy or a girl because I'm not going to give away who this was of my 4 wonderful grandkids. But I was the one who was in charge and responsible, and I put this little one to sleep in the playpen. Too close to a table upon which there were a number of plants. To which the child could reach and could grab. And so sometime later, I hear this noise, and I go up into check on the child, and there in the playpen are 3 plants, dirt all over the child, the plants completely uprooted, and I'm just like, what have you done? You know, what have you done? Or maybe I can remember this: the neighbors who were over hanging out with my children and coming to the basement, and the wall was used as the place to color rather than a piece of paper. Right? What have you done? You just drew all over our wall. What have you done? Or the new driver who, yes, this happened in our family, who backed out through the garage door before putting the garage door up. Like, how do you get enough oomph, to drive the car through the door? But what have you done? What have you done? But perhaps even more seriously and more uncomfortably, the question that you say to your son or your daughter when they come home from school, after you've received the phone call from the teacher and the teacher informs you that he or she was caught texting answers to another student and is now going to have to be in detention or whatever the discipline form is these days. And the child walks in and you're like, what have you done? Or the spouse to the other spouse who makes the choice to make a significant financial purchase without speaking to the other spouse, and the other spouse finds out, and it's like, what have you done? Or the family member who's online and viewing things that are inappropriate. What have you done? Or consuming too much alcohol or drugs to help cope with whatever it is. What have you done? What have you done? I don't know if you've heard that question. I don't know if you've shared that question in your family. It's highly likely that somebody at some point in your life has asked you and said to you, what have you done? Or you've said to somebody else, what is it that you have done? And why do we ask this question? Well, the big reason we ask this question is because we want the person to stop and to reflect and to think about what it is that they have done. The whole goal in asking the question is to encourage the person to reveal, to expose, to uncover, to confess the wrong that they have done. But most often, if you think about this, most often what people do is they do anything to keep covered up that wrongdoing that they've done. They do anything to mitigate responsibility, right? They do anything to to deflect, to diffuse, to get somebody else responsible or blamed for that wrong. This tends to be the response that we as people naturally have in the place that we go to. What have you done? That's the question for this morning, and it's the question that we're going to encounter in the text that we look at this morning, Genesis chapter 44, as we continue in our series. Genesis, it all starts here. And this is a series in which we started way back in January, right? And we have been working our way methodically. And last week, we encountered Joseph, whose brothers have come for a returned visit to receive and buy grain. And they had to bring along, because Joseph required this, right? They had to bring along their youngest brother, Benjamin. And what we observed from that text is fascinating to kind of work through that text and to be reminded that 9 other times throughout the book of Genesis, this main concept of jealousy, of favoritism being shown towards somebody, therefore somebody responding in jealousy, and the favoritism that led to jealousy then led to bad and destructive behavior. And we saw how 9 times we traced our way through the book of Genesis how that had happened, and that here in this final time, they didn't respond that way, and they passed this test that Joseph had given them. Well, today, the next chapter, it's the final exam. Joseph gives the final exam. It's a final test. And the big question on the test is, what have you done? So I invite you to turn to Genesis 44 with me, and we're going to read through this passage, and I will pause as I have through many of these stories and just make a few comments before we get to the main points and to the big question. But beginning in verse 1, this is how Moses tells the story as to what happens next after they have this big feast, and Benjamin had been given 5 times as much. The very next thing in the story is this. Now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his house. Fill the men's sack with as much food as they can carry, and put each man's silver in the mouth of his sack. Then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, that's Benjamin, along with the silver for his grain. And he did as Joseph said. Now as morning dawned, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys. So they're going back home to Canaan. They're going back home to see their father Israel. They had not gone very far from the city when Joseph said to the steward, now go after those men at once, and when you catch up with them, say to them, why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this cup my master drinks from, and also uses for divination? Why have you taken it, right? Why have you done this? This is a wicked thing that you have done. Now pause for just a second. This cup used for divination. This is a common Egyptian practice. There's a number of archaeological evidences that we have. This number of writings in which these practices are identified. And a cup was used to mix oil in water, and the water, depending on how the water and oil mixed, would lead the person interpreting it towards the conclusion of yes or no, this is what we should do. It's kind of like a magic 8-ball, or other forms of divination that are even practiced today. People attempting to try to discern what I should do into the future, how to make decisions. Now, this cup of divination is what Joseph says, go after them and say, why did you take my master's cup of divination? Again, this would be an Egyptian practice. Most likely, highly unlikely, that Joseph himself was actually practicing divination. He's just using it under the guise of being the Egyptian leader. And they would understand these Egyptian practices. So, continuing, verse 4, when the steward caught up with him, he repeated these words to them. But they said to him, why does my Lord say such things? This is crazy. Far be it from your servants to do anything like that. We even brought back to you from the land of Canaan the silver we found in the mouths of our sacks the first time. Like, why would we do this? This doesn't make any sense. So why would we even steal more silver or gold from our master's house? Now, you've heard me emphasize that word silver. There's 5 times that it's occurred so far in these very few verses. And it seems as though the writer is helping to make this connection between the silver that they paid for the grain to the 22 shekels, or to the 20 shekels of silver that the brothers sold Joseph to Egypt for 22 years prior. Silver is significant. It's how Joseph got to Egypt. Silver is also what is bringing the brothers to Egypt and has them in this final test. The story goes on, if any of your servants is found to have it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. So this is their response. This is crazy. There's no way we would have done it. And if you find it in any of our sacks, then the one who has the cup, that one will die, and the rest of us will become your slaves. So this is the offer that the brothers are making to this steward of Joseph's house. Well, very well. Note what the steward says. Very well. Let it be as you say. And then he changes what it is that they say. He says, whoever is found to have it will become my slave. So nobody's going to die. It's just the person who has it is going to become my slave. Now, isn't that interesting? The person with the cup, who's the person with the cup? The person with the cup is Benjamin. Benjamin is going to become who? What? Joseph's slaves. What happened to Joseph with the selling of 20 shekels of silver? He was sent to Egypt to become a slave. Now, each of them quickly lowered his sack to the ground and opened it, right? And they're opening it in complete understanding and confidence that there's no silver in their sack and there's no cup in the sack because they know that none of them did that. And so they open it up. And then the steward, and it's very interesting how the steward goes about this process too. It's as though it's to drag out the agony of the process. So the steward proceeds to search, beginning with the oldest. The steward knows where the cup is, right? The steward could have just went to Benjamin and picked it out, but he doesn't. He starts with the oldest. And then he goes to the next oldest, which again is so confusing. Like back to the story from last week. They were all seated according from oldest to youngest. How does the steward know all this information about us? But the steward goes from one sack to the next. And eventually, the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Oh no. And so this is the test. This is the final exam. The test that Joseph is establishing for his brothers is this. What will you do when your brother, who for silver is caught? Will you sell him out the way that you sold me out to Egypt to be put into slavery? Will you turn on him? In other words, because this is a really uncomfortable situation, we're all in trouble here, but only the guy with the cup, that's the guy, the only guy who's supposed to get in trouble. So what are you going to do? So Joseph sets up this scenario, this situation for him. And you can imagine what it would be like. Again, as you read through the story, you have to put yourself into the place of the character and think about what it would be like to be one of these 10, or put Benjamin in there, one of the 11. What is Benjamin thinking? He's got the cup in his sack. And then, verse 13, at this, they tore their clothes, and then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. And again, this is interesting. They tear their clothes. Remember what the brothers did after they sold Joseph for 20 shekels of silver to Egypt for slavery? They tore his coat. They tore his coat to make it look as though a wild animal had killed him. And now the text tells us that they tear their clothes out of remorse, out of fear, out of an overwhelming sense of this is a horrible thing happening to us. And then verse 14, so they load up, they go back to the city. Joseph was still in the house when significant character Judah, okay? And he's significant because, remember, he's the fourth born. He's the character who's been mentioned repeatedly since chapter 37, when the story about Joseph started. In 38, it was all about Judah. And then it's Judah who's the lead the whole way through. And we've emphasized this already. The Judah, the fourth born. He ends up being the one through whom the blessing ultimately carries on and passes. But anyways, Joseph was still in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves to the ground before him. And Joseph said to them, here it is. Here's the question for the test, the final exam. What is this that you have done? What is this that you have done? And don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination? I want to pause here for quite some time and actually reflect on this question. What is it that you have done? Now, interestingly, this is not the first time that question has been asked as we've worked our way through the book of Genesis. Actually, that question has been posed 7 other times. 7 other times. There's an interesting academic article that was written in 2019. Harper, I'll get these guys right. Jeffrey Harper and Alex Lee are the authors of the title of the article is Dodging the Question. And it appeared in the Tyndale Bulletin, in which they trace that question. What is it that you have done throughout the book of Genesis? Now, this question right here appearing here in chapter 44 is the 8th time and the final time. But we're going to look, just take a quick couple of minutes here and look at the 7 prior times in the book of Genesis that the question was asked. What is it that you have done? The first time we encountered it, you probably remember this, right? The first time that we encountered it, it was God saying this to Eve. Adam and Eve had taken from the fruit in the garden. They had hid from God when they heard him walking in the garden. God says, what's going on? Adam says, well, we were afraid because we were naked. And God says, how do you know that you're naked? Did you eat from the fruit that you weren't supposed to? Very similar question. How did you know? But very specifically to Eve, when he confronts Eve, the Lord God said to the woman, what is it that you have done? What is it, Eve, that you have done? Now, why does God ask the question? Because he wants Eve to stop. He wants Eve to reflect. He wants Eve to consider what it is that she did. He wants her to think about the act of what she did, of taking the fruit. He wants her to not only think about the act of taking the fruit, but think about the act of how taking the fruit and eating the fruit was a violation. It was in disobedience to what he had said. You can't eat from that fruit. He wants Eve to say, I disobeyed. But what does Eve say? Eve says, well, God, that serpent that was in the garden, the serpent deceived me. Adam said the same thing, right? Adam, why did you do that? Well, my wife, she gave it to me. Right? What did they do? They shifted blame. Neither of them acknowledged. Neither of them allowed the uncovering of their sin to be exposed in front of their eyes, for them to acknowledge it, to admit it, and to live up to it. That's the first time. Second time, I'm going to have to go a little quicker through each of these. The second time is the next page. It's Genesis chapter 4. It's the brothers Cain and Abel. And remember, they brought a sacrifice to God. And Cain's was not accepted. Abel's was the one that was accepted. And Cain got mad about this. And God said, hey, look, sin is waiting at the door. It's crouching there. It wants to strangle you. It wants to have you. And then the story goes on, and Cain attacks his brother in the field and kills him. And then God comes to Cain and says, Cain, what have you done? And then the next thing he says is, listen. Your brother's blood cries out from the ground. Again, God asked this question to get Cain to acknowledge and to admit and to confess his sin. But instead, what is it that Cain does? Well, God goes on and says, you did this, and therefore you're going to be cursed. I'm going to send you away, and on with this cursing. And Cain's response to this whole thing is what? Well, my punishment is more than I can bear. God, you're not being very fair or very kind on this. It's like you correcting your kid, right? And the kid is just furious because you discipline the kid for their wrongdoing. And then they start calling you names. You're a terrible mom. You're a mean dad. You don't love me. You're this. You're that. Blah, 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 blah. Or you've heard that? Heard that? Say that as a kid? I can remember saying that as a kid. Why? Shifting the blame, right? And not wanting to be responsible and kind of changing the focus of the conversation and making it on the person of authority who's correct in bringing this out. And so it's a protest and it's a complaint. Next time it appears is Genesis 13, and this is 12, and this is the story of Abraham, in which he takes his wife Sarah and he says to her, hey, we're going into Egypt, there's a famine in the land, tell these people that you're my sister. And so the king takes Sarah to be his wife. God doesn't like this, so brings a curse upon the king, and this is what happens. So Pharaoh is the one who goes to Abraham and says, what have you done to me? And then what is Abraham's answer? Now here is your wife, take her, go. And what does Abraham do? It's interesting. He says nothing, right? And so Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev. He left. It's as though he's hiding his motives. He doesn't want to be confronted with it. We find the same story again in Genesis chapter 20. It's a similar story. Abimelech. Abraham goes with his wife, says, tell these people you're my sister. Same deal happens. Abimelech, king of Gerar. What have you've done to us? And Abraham replied, I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place. They will kill me because of my wife. And besides, she really is my sister. And so what does he do here? He's like, well, I can't trust these people. These people, they're not, they don't fear God. And so he rationalizes. Right? So we're going to just tweak this. She really is my sister. She's my half-sister. And we're not going to talk about the fact she's my wife. We'll just talk about this other part. And he rationalizes his choice. He rationalizes his behavior. And, isn't that what people do all the time, right? It was only a little thing that I stole. It's not really that big of a lie that I told. It's not going to have that bad or that negative of an impact. Right? Rationalization. Fifth time, it's the same story, except now it's Abraham's son. He modeled so well, horribly, right? But Isaac does the same thing. He tells the king, same king, hey, my wife, she's only my sister. And then the king says, what is this you've done? And same response by Isaac. Isaac, he just goes on with life, and he plants his crops, and God blesses his crops, and it's a crazy story. Isaac says absolutely nothing. Again, silence and hiding of his motives. The next one is the story of Jacob when he wakes up. Genesis 29. When Jacob wakes up in the morning with Leah, his wife, but it's supposed to be Rachel, his wife. Right? He wakes up and he goes to Laban. He's like, "What have you done to me? Like you switched out the daughters. I mean, this isn't right." And what does Laban say? Well, Laban says, "Well, it's not our custom here to do things that way." He makes excuses. And then the next one is when Jacob is fleeing from Laban. And Laban approaches him and says, "What have you done?" And Jacob's like, I was afraid of you, so we had to get out of here. All right, long process here. But what I want us to see, what I think is significant for us to see, is if you're reading the book of Genesis, right? Genesis, it all starts here. One of the themes through the book of Genesis is there is favoritism, there's love that's shown, right? And thus jealousy and thus hatred. But another theme is this theme of what is it that you have done? It's this theme of, hey, there's sin, and sin needs to be confronted, sin needs to be dealt with, and people don't. We keep things covered up, we make excuses. So this next slide puts it all together in a chart for us to see what people did, but also to see the result. So the result is pretty significant. The result is relational fallout. It's a banishment. It's being cursed from the garden for Eve's act. And on, you see all of this relational fallout, separation, brokenness of relationship, extended family messed up. There's mistrust, there's anger, there's all. And when we don't acknowledge, this is what Genesis is teaching, when people don't acknowledge what they did, then what they bring about is a whole lot more negative situations in their life. Now, let's go back to where we were in 14 and read it again. So Joseph was still in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and note what happens. They throw themselves to the ground before him. A couple things to note about that. Remember the dream. Remember the dream that appeared twice. This is like the third, fourth time that these guys are on their knees in front of Joseph, bowing down before him. But this one is like the most intense. They throw themselves on the ground before him. There's just this absolute sense of helplessness. They're begging him. They're completely broken. They are so weighted down by their situation. There's nothing that they can do except just throw themselves in front of him to seek his mercy, his grace, his forgiveness, to get something from him. Now, it's interesting that they throw themselves to the ground. Again, connecting it to the dream, but beyond the dream. Remember that it was Judah who convinced the brothers to throw Joseph into the pit. And then it was Judah who convinced them to get Joseph out of the pit and to sell him into slavery into Egypt. And here we have Judah throwing himself on the ground in front of Joseph. It's pretty significant. There's this sense of deep ownership, this deep brokenness over their situation. There's this sense that there are consequences for their past choices, and they are feeling the weight of those consequences. They recognize and they are convinced, we saw this in Genesis 42, verse 21, that the reason that they were experiencing these things is because God was punishing them for the way that they had treated their brother Joseph. And they did not listen to him while he was in the pit. And then Joseph says to him, "What is this you've done? Don't you know that a man like me can find things out by divination?" And then Judah says this, "What can we say to my Lord? What can we say? How can we prove our innocence?" It's almost like you say, we are just completely broke. If we didn't do this, and I don't know how to convince you. And then he says this, God has uncovered our guilt. God has exposed our guilt. God has stuck our guilt in front of our face. Somehow, it is as though he's saying, somehow, mysteriously, God has put this silver cup into Benjamin's sack as a punishment for our actions towards our brother Joseph 22 years earlier. It is this sense in which God is involved in this. How? We don't know. It's a mystery. But it is God who is uncovering our guilt. Oh, and this becomes so significant when we ask the question and when you're confronted with the question, what is it that you have done? Because we ask the question, why? To expose, to uncover, to reveal. But we want the person who did the wrong act to see, to hear, and to say, it's true. I'm guilty. I did it. And that is what is happening here with Judah. He is saying, I'm guilty. We're all guilty. We did this. And that is a very different response from all of the other responses in the book of Genesis, thereby helping us to see that the right response when you are asked, what is it that you have done? The right response is to allow that to be uncovered and to be exposed, because it will produce then a good and right way forward, which is what we'll see here at the end of this text. So Joseph said, far be it from me. Oh, no. So Judah then says this, we are now my Lord's slaves, we ourselves, and the one who is found to have the cup. So now Judah says we're all going to be responsible. We're not leaving Benjamin behind, right? This is the opportunity. Sell Benjamin out. We'll go free. We'll go back home. We'll do the same thing to Joseph. And the response is no. The response is we're all in this together. That's the right answer. But Joseph said, oh, far be it from me to do such a thing. Only the man who is found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you go back to your father in peace. Then Judah went up to him and said, please, my lord, let your servant speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. And my lord asked his servants, do you have a father or a brother? And listen to his plea now. And we answered, we have an aged father, and there's a young son born to him in his old age, and his brother is dead. So now they're talking about Joseph. And Joseph is listening to Judah plead this. He's like, my brother Joseph is dead. And we have an aged father, there's a young son born to him, his brother is dead, and he's the only one of my mother's sons left, which is interesting to say. It's not really true. He's the only one of his mother's sons left, and his father loves him. But it certainly is true the way that it's been for all of the other 10 brothers, right? It's been Joseph and it's been Benjamin whom Jacob has loved. It is though the other 10 don't exist. And yet Judah repeats this. He could have said, oh, hey, he could have changed the story. Then you said to your servant, bring him down to me so I can see him for myself. So we obeyed you. We brought the boy down. The boy can't leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die. But you told your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again. So we went back to your servant, my father. We told him what you had said. Then our father said, go back, buy a little food. We cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us can we go. We can't see the man's face unless your youngest brother is with us. So he's just recounting all the story, right? And your servant, my father, said, okay, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. Again, this big emphasis on this favoritism, this love. One of them went away from me. And I said, he was surely been torn to pieces. There's that torn again. And I have not seen him since. And so Jacob doesn't know that Joseph's alive. None of the brothers know that Joseph's alive. They all think he's dead. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the ground in misery. Again, this affection, this love that Jacob has for the wife whom he loves and their kids. So now, if the boy is not with us, when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with my boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. And your servants will bring the gray head of your father down to the grave in sorrow. This is a horrible thing. Don't you understand this, king? Please, let us go back. Don't do this. And then look at the final response. Your servant, this is Judah, guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. And I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame. I will bear the blame. This is the first time, well, let me finish here. Before you, my father, all my life. And then he says this, now then, please, let your servant remain here. Let me, Judah, remain here as your slave in the place of the boy. And let the boy return with his brothers. This is the first time in the book of Genesis in which we see a person say, I will sacrifice my life so that somebody else can go free. It's such a fascinating story. And as you begin to understand, and as you look at this, especially those of us who have the New Testament, and we understand who Jesus Christ is, and we understand that Jesus is God in flesh, and that he came, and he says that anybody who is stuck in their sin, who is willing to have their sin exposed, their sin revealed, their sin uncovered, anybody who acknowledges that can exchange the guilt of it, and I'll take it. I'll be the one that will hold the responsibility for it, and I'll take the penalty of it. I will stand in place of the guilty person. And this is what Judah does. Judah says, I will stand in Benjamin's place. And the story ends. Story ends right there. Two things, and I'm going to invite our worship team to come on up. So there's the 2 points to highlight from this whole story. Go to the last slide there, the one with the grid and all the things put together. There we go. So there's the big long list, right? And here is the 8th time that the question appears, what is it that you have done? And in this time, there's 2 responses that are very different than the responses of all the other times. The other time it's to blame shift, it's to protest, it's to remain silent, it's to judge, it's to rationalize, it's to excuse motives. But in this time, it's to surrender, it's to acknowledge, it's to say, my sin has been uncovered, and I acknowledge it, I admit it, I see it, I recognize it. So often our sin is uncovered. Too often our sin is uncovered, but we don't acknowledge it. We don't admit it. So we're left still there with it. We're left stuck with it. But when we surrender, and we understand that there's a sacrifice, that Judah made this sacrifice, he said, go in my place, I will be exchanged in his place. When you understand those 2 things, what then ends up happening? We're going to look at this next week, but what ends up happening is there's a renewed affection. The brothers Joseph eventually will reveal himself. There's going to be renewed family connection because they surrendered in sacrifice. They passed the test. This is the only way to pass the test. When we are asked, what is it that you have done? The only answer, the correct answer, is to surrender and to sacrifice. And when we answer like that, we find and experience renewed affection, reconciliation, and then a relocation to someplace so much better than where they had been. So I leave you with this final statement. When you own your sin, Jesus will take it. But if you hide your sin, you keep it. You keep it. Stand and let's sing this final song together, giving thanks that Jesus took our sin.
shall soon dissolve like snow. The sun forbear to shine, but God who called me
I read this story this past week of this lady, I don't know, maybe you read this too, who found a 2.3 carat diamond. Apparently you can go to Diamond Crater State Park in Arkansas and you can look for diamonds and they're yours if you find them. And the story goes like this: she'd been digging for 2 weeks and trying to find a diamond because she was going to be getting engaged and she wanted, this. And it was near the end of her time there, and she says she took this bucket to go over and to sift it through the water, and she turned around and I think she was seated. She turned around and she looked and she saw this cobweb, or this spider's web, and a little bit of glistening, and she thought it was the dew. And so with her boot, she just kind of kicked it. But when it kept glistening, she kicked it again, and she kicked it again, and she completely uncovered it. And then, of course, experienced this great joy at finding this 2.3 carat diamond. And you think about that story and how many people walk past that diamond. How many people that week, how many people year after year after year maybe walked on that diamond that was covered up. And, the frustrating thing about that, probably for everybody else who walked past it, was like, oh, it was right there. I just needed to uncover it. But then the great joy of having it uncovered. And here's how I'm just gonna leave us with this. It's like, when our sin or when something that's wrong is uncovered, it leads to a good thing. But so often, and this is where we live, there's people in our life whose stuff, it's just buried. And it doesn't matter how often you say it and you confront it and you try, they don't have eyes to see. They don't, and even us, and we don't have eyes to see. And oh God, uncover, right? Uncover. Or in the words of Ephesians 1:18, enlighten the eyes of our heart. God, we need that. We need you to enlighten that for all of us. So go and deliver that message. Go and be sensitive towards those things. And let's be people who uncover the diamond of God's grace when we confess our sins. Have a good week.